Well, the disclaimer is supposed to be on. Do you hear it? I don't hear it. We'll pull it off if it's not on, and I'll say that this is Mae Brussell, and I am responsible for what is on the air, that this is my program. The station is not responsible, and what I say is my research, and I take all responsibility for it. And this is KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. Mae Brussell on World Watchers. It's broadcast number 605, July the 11th, 1983. This time last year, I was talking about subjects that are so much in the news now. I was just laughing when I was pulling out the sheet. In case you don't have that tape, you might like to get that. I think all the tapes are pertinent and are very timely until the official investigations are finally cleared on these matters. Would you believe just last year, July 12th, I was talking about Mr. Agca and telling the prosecutors in Rome about the plot against the Pope and his links to right-wing Turkish organization. Well, 1 year has passed, and Agca had a press conference, and he says, I like the Pope, I adore the Pope. He holds his handcuffed hands together in prayer and says, the KGB did it. 1 year later, it's the KGB. I understand the Italian investigator is now going to Bulgaria to see what kind of a story Agca is telling. A year ago this week, Reagan was sued for palimony by VICKI Morgan. And, of course, this week she was murdered, and we're going to go right into that in a few minutes or as soon as possible, talking about the bludgeoning death of VICKI Morgan. I really played that around in my mind just ever since I heard it this week because she has so many interlocking connections. And just before I came into the station, it'll be a week old for some of you who get this broadcast. You will have seen it by then. The attorney for the fellow that cracked her skull open turned over carts, videotapes. He was given videotapes by the man who did the murder of top government officials going all the way to the top of the country. Sex orgies with Alfred Bloomingdale, with one prominent businessman, one elected official not from California, and 3 appointed officials of the Reagan administration. The attorney said he was going to destroy those. He didn't want to bring them up at the trial. That suit was taking place last year. Last year I was talking about Edwin Wilson, how he wanted lower bail, how he worked for the Central Intelligence Agency and been lured home to the United States. This week, Edwin Wilson's boss, Robert Gray, is involved with the stolen papers that were given to Ronald Reagan so that he could debate Jimmy Carter. They not only armed Gaddafi and Idi Amin, but they steal papers from the Democrats, identical to Watergate, and Mr. Gray, the business partner of Wilson, his name is in the papers this week, involving also sex orgies or sexual contacts with secretaries in order to get the tapes. This was their shtick. It's gone back to Lyndon Johnson days, and they're really great at doing that. They've been doing it for a long time. Last year, I was talking about the international scandal reaching into the Reagan administration of various people there, and of course the scandals this year are horrendous. I was talking about John Belushi and how the Los Angeles police used Gestapo methods and covered up the murder of John Belushi. The L.A. police chief, Gerald Gates, made the remark, Belushi was a horrible person. This was in the L.A. Examiner. He's not much of a man. There are many other important crimes to solve. We're not interested in that one. He died vomiting in the toilet and laid on some bed nude, and that, to me, that's a disgusting way to die. Now we find out a year later that Mr. Gates has this great John Reese and Louise Reese and J. Paul and Larry McDonald and Western Golds piped into his department, and now we have this murder down in Los Angeles. And VICKI Morgan, they don't want to make that a conspiracy any more than the Belushi, and there were common denominators. So I referred to the Los Angeles Police Gestapo a year ago, and this week they're tied in, John Reese, with Fritz Kraemer and General Graham of High Frontier, and we'll get into that in a few minutes. I was talking about the LAPD and their terror campaign and their payments to pay off people who sued them because of scandals that they followed and took away the civil rights of certain people. And this year later, you see how those rights are being taken. I talked about Archbishop Paul Marcinkus. Will he be forced to leave the Vatican? I asked a year ago this week. The answer is he can't get out of the Vatican. He's been locked in there a whole year. They won't deport him to the United States, and they can't kill him, and they can't let him out on the streets. He can't take a trip with the Pope anymore, and he can't play golf unless there's a golf course in St. Peter's or in the Vatican. And I talked about the scandals over the Italian Masonic Lodge and Licio Gelli, who yet hadn't been arrested. He was arrested in Switzerland the night Grace Kelly and Bashir Jamal from Lebanon were killed. He's still in a Swiss jail. He's too hot, an item to send back for trial in Italy. And then I talked about Gulf and Western, and a Seymour Hersh article, July 27, 1977, a three-part series on the Vatican, Michael Sindona, the CIA, Gulf and Western, and William Taub's book, Forces of Power, the whole Dominican Republic intrigue that Edwin Wilson and Richard Nixon were involved in. Marvelous report story. I didn't even get to finish that. There was so much news that followed that week. But everything we talked about a year ago is still boiling and on the burners, so it's interesting to look back and see what I was doing a year ago tonight. One item to correct. I don't have too many usually, or else you're not telling me, but I appreciate them. I have a correction on past tapes, and I'll make clear it doesn't happen on future tapes. I refer sometimes on and off of Robert Morris from Young Americans for Freedom, who works with the space program and with the Nazis from Munich that came over to help with the killing of John Kennedy. Robert Morris is not the president of the University of Texas. He's president of the University of Dallas, which is a Catholic school in Dallas, Texas, a small college where he has interesting conferences, and correction on that. It is not the University of Texas. Now, the London Times had a great story, and the Washington Post is having a three-part story on how Klaus Barbie and the top Nazis left Europe, worked for the United States, and the route that took them out of Europe when they were recognized as war criminals, the known criminals, and allowed to escape to South America and all around the world. The London Times story is called The Rat Lines, and it gives the names of the agents who helped Klaus Barbie, and they worked in the 970th CIC. That's a abbreviation for the intelligence agencies, the CIC, Counterintelligence Corps, the 970th Counterintelligence Corps in Germany, housing Barbie when the French wanted Klaus Barbie, and we were using him to teach how to interrogate resistance fighters. Remember, resistance is anybody who doesn't like a Nazi. And they said, yeah, he taught about hoses and a few other things. Well, I'll do more on this article later. I outlined it. I may do a little before I finish the broadcast, but I want to get to the Vicki Morgan story. But it tells about the 970th Division of this Counterintelligence Corps. And also, besides the London Times, if you can't get it, I'll copy it for you if you send a self-addressed stamped envelope. But the Washington Post is carrying a three-part series on Klaus Barbie and how the United States agents helped him and other Nazis from the Counterintelligence Corps. Now, the very group that is described in the London Times and the Washington Post is given a section on page 26 and 27 of Seymour Hersh's new book on Henry Kissinger, that marvelous book called The Price of Power. And he's telling about Henry Kissinger's early background, how from Harvard professor he goes to national security. And last week we were talking a little bit about the Henry Kissinger book, the Seymour Hersh book, and I'll be referring to it maybe once a week, different sections of it. But this is pertinent to the Washington Post stories and the London Times now. He tells about Henry Kissinger's background in covert intelligence and how he worked for the 970th CIC detachment. That is Klaus Barbie, and he has him in the identical place working in active duty after the war in occupied Germany, assigned to the 970th CIC detachment, whose function was to support the recruitment of Nazi intelligence officers for anti-Soviet operations. This is the moment the war was over. He was to send them behind the Soviet bloc. After entering Harvard as an undergraduate in 1947, at age 24, he kept his ties with military intelligence and as a graduate student started working in the Defense Department in 1950. The 970th Detachment, known later, it was referred to the 66, was under orders after the war to get information on Nazis that we could use for Soviet, anti-Soviet operations, our allies that stopped Adolf Hitler with their great battles and had the guts to do that. He was compiling information for anti-Soviet operations in the Ukraine and elsewhere inside Russia. Such work was carried out at secret bases in Germany. Kissinger was transferred to the Army's Military Intelligence Service, was an instructor at the Army's European Command Intelligence School at Ober-Ammergau, O-B-E-R, it's Ober, O-B-E-R-A-M-M-E-R-G-A-U in Western Germany. At the same time, the facility was training American intelligence officers to learn to exploit and use Nazi collaborators and displaced people from the camp. Kissinger stayed on at Oberammergau as a civilian instructor for 1.5 years, got out of the Army in May of 1946, and stayed there and was with the Joint Chief of Staff working with high Nazis to go against the Soviet Union. Now, that is timely with the Seymour Hersh book that is out, the London Times article, and National Solidarity, New Solidarity had a story March 21st, and this is 1983, this is several months ago, Justice Department to investigate Klaus Barbie, and it said a real investigation into Barbie's protectors and the U.S. intelligence will lead to such prominent citizens as John J. McCloy, the High Commissioner for Germany. He's the one who, in the London Times article, helped write the passport and the alias for Klaus Barbie so that he could go over to Bolivia and become the cocaine king and throw this country into the terrible problems of narcotics in this country. The New Solidarity says the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell was used, and Henry Kissinger was the debriefing officer for Barbie at Oberammergau, along with General Julius Klein and Alan Dulles and Frank Wiesner of the State Department Office of Policy Coordination. So the London Times, the Washington Post, and the Seymour Hersh articles are pregnant with information about the people that got Barbie out, who they were and their attitudes, and I will get onto that, as I say, in a few weeks. I'll do the details, but you can get those articles in the meantime. A book review of Seymour Hersh's book by Henry Mayer hits the problem of Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kraemer in the essence of what I try to say week after week on this program, and to smoke these people out. Henry Mayer, M-A-Y-E-R, is a Berkeley writer and critic who wrote a review, and I just want to share a few sentences of what he says about the price of power, because it's so accurate in describing what Seymour Hersh is saying and who he's dealing with. He says Seymour Hersh has put forward an indictment of Henry Kissinger's conduct as National Security Advisor that is even more formidable and troubling than the headlines have led us to expect. The charges are grave. Hersh accuses Kissinger of usurping power and exercising it in virtually totalitarian manner. That's what he did. See, instead of teaching the Nazis, they taught him how to get power at Oberammergau, how they got it for Hitler from World War I. They were fighters from World War I. As a presidential appointee, he wrote, Hersh argues Kissinger employed the bureaucratic art of flattery, intrigue, duplicity to preempt authority constitutionally, assigned to the President, the Secretary of State, and Defense, assigned to the Secretary of State. Now, that is exactly the essence of Kissinger and Kraemer and Colonel Willoughby. The totalitarian manner isn't something they picked up. Their teachers were Franco from Spain and Adolf Hitler and the top Nazis. They usurped the Constitution, and that's a checks and balance that I said went out when the National Security Agency was formed. And then this reviewer, Henry Mayer, goes on to say, having acquired an awesome degree of illegitimate power, Kissinger used it capriciously and secretly, and he used it for not the national interest, but his personal ambition. And he was at conflict with the laws of the land, but he usurped the power. And that's exactly what Reinhard Gehlen and the top Nazis did. The orders, the constitutional orders, were put the criminals in jail. The U.S. Army and the United States bankers on their own said, no, we want to use them for the next war. This is a very good book review about America's top writer. It said this story pits the most talented investigative reporter against America's most celebrated diplomat. And there are a lot of reviews. The New York Times had a review in the magazine section, but it's done by a fellow at Harvard, one of Henry Kissinger's playmates from Harvard. So when you see who writes it, and it's not an objective history, Harvard isn't going to let their genius be put down by a book of Seymour Hersh. So history will have to decide, and it is on the bestseller list very quickly, and I hope it stays there forever. Just a short story that came out in New Solidarity, June 20th, 1983. There's a conference in Denver, Colorado, June 14th, of the High Frontier Group. General Daniel Graham, that's the fellow that I said he was the head of the entire Defense Intelligence Agency, and sharing the three-day conference on the podium with Graham was John REESE, the aide to the articles as the Rabbi John Bircher and Georgia Congressman Larry McDonald Reese is from British Intelligence Trained Security. Now, I've done a few broadcasts on Larry Reese. I have many, many more to do. His role described in Covert Action and Private Eye, and in Spotlight, the role of John Reese, the terror. He's literally the terror network of the United States, the guru of the new right. Spotlight has a lot of articles that were given to me by somebody who listens to these programs, and it hints that he murdered Grace Metalius, Metalious, the woman who wrote Peyton Place. Well, he lived with her just before she died and got the rights to her books away from her family and children and took over the author of Peyton Place. And John Reese works with Larry McDonald, Roy Cohn, and Admiral Moore, described in the Kissinger book. And now he's on the podium working with this General Graham. And Graham, as I told you, was an April 18th broadcast. Graham is co-partner in Washington with Fritz Kraemer, the Institute on Strategic Trade. So what we get are all these scumbags working together, Admiral Moore and Edward Teller, John Reese and Graham and Fritz Kraemer, and Henry Kissinger in the news with his various escapades to the different countries, still trying to be the great spokesman for America. But I thought it was interesting that a man of such a low reputation as John Reese, and it almost demands that I soon give you some biographies and stories about John Reese and his links to the Christian military Nazi Klan group, because you see here is Robert Morris working for them and working with the space stations up at Princeton. You have Graham of High Frontier wanting the weapons up in the space stations. John Reese and his wife headed the House Un-American Activities with her list. Robert Morris was head of the attorney for Senator Joe McCarthy and their list of blacklisting of citizens who hadn't committed any crimes. And Larry McDonald from Murder Incorporated down in Georgia, and Admiral Moore stealing from the White House. There's a lot of things about him in the Seymour Hersh book. Admiral Moore, of course, his close contacts to Lehman, John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy, Grace Kelly's first cousin. So when there's a conference, a 3-day conference up in Colorado this last month, and Reese shares the podium with Graham, it's even more obvious where they're going and how close they are to all linking together. Western Goals, the organization that they're all part of, was set up by Roger Milliken and J. Peter Grace, funded Milliken and John Reese. So if John Reese is on the podium with General Graham of the Defense Intelligence Agency, the partner with Fritz Kraemer in Washington, he comes right out of J. Peter Grace, Auschwitz, Zyklon B, and the whole network over in Europe of Otto Ambrose and I.G. Farben. The interesting thing, after doing many years research, and I know so many of you do get books and study these tapes that I have, is to see the names overlapping now in the news. Maybe Graham was with Reese a few years ago and we didn't notice it, but it really seems flagrant now and interesting in a way. Scary, but interesting. Now getting to the complicated story of Vicki Morgan, as much as I can do in the remaining 40 minutes. I'll call it part one, but I'll get to it. I'm trying to make it as simple for you, a complex subject, as simple as I can. In March of 1982, March the 5th, the Wall Street Journal had a story that Alfred Bloomingdale was appointed by Ronald Reagan to a new group called the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. That Wall Street Journal had that story naming Richard Allen as an advisor. Richard Allen was the National Security Council chief, and Covert Action in summer of 82 also had the article on the appointment in March of 82. So Alfred Bloomingdale in March still had his rockers. He couldn't very much be dying of cancer. He couldn't be very senile. To be put on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, you imagine what kind of top clearance you have to have, by the President of the United States, his closest friend, and his wife is Nancy Reagan's best friend. In March, he was put on that board. Well, in February 12th, 1982, just weeks before he was put on the board, 3 weeks before he was put on the board, Bloomingdale had a written contract with Vicki Morgan giving her 10% of the Showbiz Pizza place. That's in 30 or more states. It was a written promise of $10,000 a month for 2 years. Her profits were to come out of a group called Marina Bay, Fort Lauderdale, Texas, and her paychecks came from Fort Lauderdale, and we'll do more about that in a little while. Now, just at the time that this story is breaking about Ronald Reagan and the stolen papers, I want to make a continuity between Richard Allen and Mr. Robert Gray and Edwin Wilson and George Bush and the Central Intelligence Agency and Mr. Bloomingdale and Ronald Reagan, because Vicki Morgan shared herself and her time with Bernie Cornfeld and traveled overseas with him with an investment overseas international, the investor group. And she had a finger in espionage. She traveled as a wife on trips that Betsy didn't go on, and Vicki Morgan had various looks or disguises, long blonde hair, and you usually see that hard picture of her, but I have a picture of her with Bloomingdale and with Cornfeld, and she's very relaxed and she's very pretty. Now, when the scandals came out about the president and being coached with papers from the Jimmy Carter campaign, at first you'd think it was 1 or 2 papers. Then it was, as you know, 1,000 papers and briefing books, and they were papers from the National Security Council. Some have already showed up out at Stanford at the Hoover Library. They were filched, they were stolen from the Democratic Party for one purpose: to get the President of the United States elected, to make him look good, not so he wouldn't look old and he wouldn't look dumb. And he called up a columnist, George Will, and I understand said, "How dare you say I needed coaching? I've been around 30 years. He wouldn't work an hour without a piece of paper to answer true facts on things. He could grin and make jokes. But when the papers were filched, and I don't know what word you want me to use, stolen, filched, purloined, an article in San Francisco Examiner, July the 7th, Carter paper caper. Remember Watergate was a caper? The president resigned. The vice president, Agner, was out. The attorney general went to jail. The appointment secretary went to jail. The chief of staff went to jail. It was quite a caper, okay? And 30 people were blown off the face of the earth, but they call this a caper again. Sex and a White House mole. And they don't go into it much. The Examiner suggests that there are sexual favors involved and that both sexes had established intimate relationships with people of the opposite sex in the Carter camp. And in quotes, a story says it may have been orchestrated by the Reagan people. We're pursuing it. I think it's most likely avenue right now. Remember, at the time of Watergate, they were setting up whorehouses on yachts down in Miami, and nobody was charged with that kind of activity, or the chance that all the girls at Chappaquiddick were CIA women there to frame Ted Kennedy from running for president and even killing Mary Jo Kopechne, if that would be sure to be the coup de grace for his election. Sex is not the subject just alone tonight, but sex is used, and this article brings out the fact that Richard Allen was involved in Edwin Meese, and people around close to Ronald Reagan, and including Bob Gray, campaign deputy director for communications, now a Washington public relations executive. So we have stolen papers from the Democrats. You have the top cabinet positions like CIA Director William Casey getting the papers, and Edwin Meese, the head advisor to the president, and Richard Allen, who's been deposed for one alleged infraction of behavior already. He was removed from National Security Council, but he's still advisor and worked with Mr. Bloomingdale and all the others. But the point is that not only do you have the stolen papers and the top people knowing it, but you have Bob Gray, who was a campaign director for communications. Now, Bob Gray had an office with Edwin Wilson in Washington, D.C. So what would you expect from those kinds of people if they ran an office together? Edwin Wilson and Frank Turpel's expertise in Corcola was blackmail, sex, framing, overturning countries, coups, assassination. So Mr. Gray, right out of the office of Edwin Wilson, with all the scandals of Wilson arming Gaddafi and being linked to Carlos the terrorist and his primary witnesses like Kevin Mulcahy being murdered and Mr. Duberstein being murdered. Here's Mr. Gray running the Ronald Reagan campaign at the time of re-election. Now, in 1982, January 82, George Bush was here at the Monterey Peninsula talking at the Republican convention. So I had about 1,000 sheets made to circulate to people out in front who were protesting and inside the Doubletree Hotel. Many of you have that sheet. If you don't have, you can write to me and send a self-addressed stamped envelope. It was called the CIA, George Bush, and Political Assassinations. And I mentioned Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence, forming the agency, and that CIA director George Bush was there from 1976 to 77 when Orlando Letelier was murdered in Washington and Ronnie Moffat, and that he's now vice president, and how he entertained Mr. Mubarak the day before Sadat was murdered, and then Mubarak went back to be president of Egypt. I said in the sheet, CIA Director George Bush worked directly with or supplied weapons for murder and torture to the CIA assassination teams of Edwin Wilson, Frank Turpel, George Corcola, and Theodore Shackley. And there's no proof that they ever left the CIA, and that he's linked to the Nugan banks, the Heron, the scandals of Frank Nugan and Michael Hand, and John Hinckley's family also. Now, that was in January that I was mentioning the links of George Bush. And this week, Mr. Gray from Edwin Wilson's office, Wilson worked for George Bush, is part of the team that got the Purloined Papers that assured that Ronald Reagan looked glorious when he debated Jimmy Carter. Now, a new book just came out. It's a 1983 book called Libyan Sandstorm. It's a great book, and in fact, David Emery was the first person who found this book or the references and called me. It's published by Holt Reinhardt and Winston, and Tom Davis at Ares Research has those books if you want them. In this book, on page 162 and 163, it tells about Frank Turple working for the CIA and the U.S. Army and his organization called Oceanic International Corporation, and Edwin P. Wilson, and his office in Washington he had after his Bay of Pigs operation with the Kennedy assassination teams. It doesn't say in the book. It says after the Bay of Pigs. In Washington, he had a firm called Consultants International, a front for the CIA and for U.S. naval activity. A member of Consultants International was a leading Republican public relations man named Robert Keith Gray, who was co-chairman of Ronald Reagan's inaugural committee. You had Johnny Carson. I brought in a picture. You can't see it on the radio, but you can describe it. Johnny Carson putting on the banquets and balls for Ronald Reagan's inauguration, who's now linked to the mom syndicate, Robert Durand, and his failing bank in the Cayman Island washings and money washings. That scandal breaking headlines in the Los Angeles papers, not nationally, but the Johnny Carson mob connections that tie into John DeLorean, that whole parcel. So the inauguration of Johnny Carson giving some of the parties, Frank Sinatra, who was discovered by Alfred Bloomingdale, he was the protege of Alfred Bloomingdale from his early career, putting on the inaugural ball, and along with co-chairman Robert Gray from Edwin Wilson's office. Of course they were celebrating. They had stolen papers and goodness knows what else, and they could manipulate every point of the State Department to make sure the hostages didn't get home because Jimmy Carter would win the election. They maneuvered the day that the hostages could come in. Jimmy Carter couldn't fool them and bring them in because they would panic if Carter looked good and the hostages were home. They came home not one day after Ronald Reagan took the oath of office. Within an hour, they were on their way. That was all orchestrated for the election to keep saying Carter's wishy-washy, and they had papers from the National Security Council, from the Defense Department, and so forth. So the book Libyan Sandstorm, it's by Mr. Cooley, goes into Robert Gray and the inaugural committee and working for Edwin Wilson, who then set up Task Force 157, an Office of Navy Intelligence, and Wilson worked with George Bush. Now, what you have here in this script of the stolen papers, besides the sex part, and I'll get to Vicki Morgan and more on that in a moment, you have people like Edwin Meese coaching Reagan to become president of the United States. You have David Stockman rehearsing with him, and George Will, the newspaper man, getting on saying he was magnificent tonight with his debate. He handled everything beautifully. He had coached him the same day, and there's a lot of controversy. Some papers are stopping his columns for this kind of journalistic deception. Training a man with stolen papers, then getting on television and saying how great he did. It's coming a full cycle. But you have Stockman becomes head of the Office of Management Budget. Casey, with the purloined history from the OSS and the CIA, who could blackmail anything walking on the face of the earth, with the major corporations that he represents as an attorney, and with William Rogers. He's attorney also, Rogers of 20th Century Fox, along with Casey. Not to digress too far to that can of worms. But here you have Casey becomes the CIA director, and William Allen, Richard Allen, rather, he becomes the head of the National Security Council. And even Jean Kirkpatrick, who was a professor at the time, was appointed head of the United Nations to work with every fascist organization. She came in the house where Reagan lived, little kitchen meetings, and they'd sit there and coach him. Carter's going to say this, and Carter will say that, and this is how you'll answer. They had a problem. I read one story. They didn't know what would happen if Carter got mean. What if they asked them the remark that when they asked Ronald Reagan as governor about Patty Hearst and the SLA, and he said this is the time to bring on the botulism and poison the people, the chicken in the food that they were handing out. And they had answers to his meanest quotations, but Jimmy Carter didn't use them. And so Ronald Reagan had rehearsed the answers to what he had said when he was governor. And it must have been a disappointment to spend all that time and hear what he said and have to live with it in the coaching session and not even have it told. Now, we'll take a 1-minute break, and then we'll go on to the second part of World Watchers International. But in the meantime, you know what we do here locally. I hope you don't run off and get a cup of coffee or tea. I want you to pledge some money to the station and send it in. I don't know if it happens or not, but KAZU FM in Pacific Grove, California, can always use and needs contributions from everybody. And each individual audience who appreciates the program they have should call in and give money to the station and say, I appreciate the program. And in that way, they know that you really do like what's on, and share that with that money you send in. You share the programs with other people who maybe can't afford it or didn't send it in. So you send in that money, and then we can have a lot of time on the air sharing these programs. I mentioned earlier, and I'll mention again, next Tuesday, the 19th at MPC, there's going to be a fundraising, a comedy hour with W.C. Fields, Marx Brothers, Spanky, Our Gang. The money will be given to KAZU. I'm sure it isn't expensive. I don't see the price for the evening here, but it can't be too much. Some of you have wanted to get together in the summer or sometime and have a discussion and talk. Maybe we could have a picnic supper. If you want to, call me and we could get together and do something, and all go see the film if you'd like to do that. Now we'll go to part 2. This is the broadcast 6:05, July the 11th, 1983. It's side 2 of the tape. If you're taping it, and I'm taping the broadcast, it's KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California, and I'm working my way slowly, but it's eventually to the Vicki Morgan story. One other story about the counsel who ignored the tips on the book, a Carter counsel. This person who worked for Jimmy Carter said he heard that the papers had been stolen, but he hadn't paid any attention to it. He thought it was too outrageous to be true. One of the people who was involved with the stolen papers, his name is Chuck Crawford, Crawford. This Crawford now works for a public relations firm of Robert Keith Gray. He helped with the stolen papers. He briefed the president. He knew they were stolen. He's been identified as a person who worked for the Reagan communication chief, Mr. Gray, and now he works for him in Washington, D.C. One thing about the far right is they take care of their own. The left never does as good as the right wing. They always take care of their own, and you've got to laud them for that. If you work together, we hire you, and we stay together. So Mr. Baker and Mr. Bush and Mr. Meese and William Van Cleve, CELEAVE, from the Defense Department, David Stockman, Gene Kirkpatrick, James Baker, a whole lot of people, Richard Allen and William Casey, will be doing more. But that's an important thing, is how many people knew and used these papers and other papers. Goodness knows how far it goes, use them to get Reagan reelected. Remember, at the Watergate Hotel, 7 people were entering the Democratic headquarters and taking papers out, and it eventually brought the scandal where the President of the United States, as I say, resigned. Here, the President is using it for his election. To become President of the United States, he needs to know what he's going to be asked, so he appears to have the answers, and that is a total fraud upon the people of the United States. Now, there's a book getting into the Bloomingdale story and Vicki Morgan, a book called Make Believe, the story of Nancy and Ronald Reagan. And it's a great book. It's by Lawrence Leamer, Leamer. Just came out, Harper and Row. It just came out. It not only has a great table of contents, it's got pictures that you will enjoy for a lifetime. The governor and his lady, a gilded dawn with their arms around each other when the inauguration is over. From their rancho to Rodeo, that's Rodeo Drive in Beverly Hills. His movie International Squadron, Captain Reagan of the Army Air Corps, who never left Hollywood when the war was going on. Pictures of Reagan with Boris Karloff and with Nancy Davis and Frank Sinatra at the White House party. Walter and Lee Annenberg, the mob king and queen. With them, Nancy sings with Frank Sinatra. Marvelous pictures. It's a wonderful book just for the pictures alone. And as I say, Frank Sinatra and with his close ties to Bloomingdale and an integral link of the Bloomingdale story, and Johnny Carson, now involved in these scandals, are in the news today. Now, there were similarities between the murder of Vicki Morgan and some of the other conspiracies. I'll just name 3. One was Kathy Smith, who was on probation for drugs many times over, who was known by the police department for selling heroin and cocaine and giving it to movie people and goodness knows who else. but she was always on the loose supplying her various goodies. She left the house where John Belushi was staying, the cottage, and he had already been dead. She described the death rattle. She didn't call 911 or tell anybody at the desk. She goes away, makes a telephone call, and comes back with a spoon and with cocaine and says, "Here I am." And the police chief Cook, who's involved with the Vicki Morgan investigation, says, "Oh, that's okay, Kathy. This wasn't murder. Belushi's a slob, and you're free." Dan White took a gun, put it in his pocket, didn't go through the detectors at City Hall, went through a window in a lavatory that he knew was open, went up to the City Hall and shot the mayor, George Moscone, and then the supervisor, Harvey Milk, went down and had a hot dog, called from a hot dog stand, called his wife, went to church, walks the police department, says, "Here I am, I killed him." And they say, "Oh, here, you want a telephone, you want some food?" The shirts were made for the guards, free Dan White. And it was a big joke. He had done that successfully, and he was the hero of the scene. Jack Ruby did one better. He killed right on television. He didn't have to make any lies. He worked with H.L. Hunt and Lamar Hunt. He was told he would be a hero, so he just went ahead and right in front of the camera shot Lee Harvey Oswald. So you know there's no conspiracy because two hands weren't on the gun. That's the way the Americans think and the police work. If one man shot the gun, then only one man's involved. So here's your television. Oswald's being transferred. They announced when. They let Ruby in the jail. They know he has guns, and he's armed up to the teeth. He's made arrangements to send his dog somewhere. He's going to be out of town for a while or put up for a while. So he says, well, here I am. And when he was arrested, the gun went off. They said, "Who is this?" And he says, "You know me. I'm Jack Ruby." And that's all recorded on tapes and things for people that want to study history. So Kathy Smith and Dan White and Jack Ruby were part of the inner team, and they didn't have to pretend what they were doing. Chivalry is not dead in two cases, if you would believe it. Jack Ruby's excuse, alleged motive at first for shooting Lee Harvey Oswald, a man who's charged with murdering the President of the United States, was that he didn't want Jackie to have the ordeal of a trial. Now, Marvin PANCOAST, the fellow that didn't shoot Vicki Morgan, he didn't even do it that nice. He took a baseball bat and smashed her head open. And if it affects me, I may just keep using that phrase because that's what happened. A story from the San Francisco Chronicle this week, July the 9th, bizarre motive for killing Vicki Morgan. Marvin PANCOAST said that's the frontline story. The woman had gone from $18,000 a month to absolutely zero, so he thought he was doing a mercy killing to save her poverty. Those are the two most chivalrous acts I can think of in my American history. Now, the cover story was that she was destitute. She needed money. The real story was that she was a full-time partner and had 10% of the pizza business, and we'll go into that. The difference between Judith Exner, who wrote a book on her sex exploitations with John Kennedy in the White House, and with Vicki Morgan were quite different. And the woman didn't take any courses in analysis or logic, I'm sure. Judith Exner sat down and wrote a book about her life with John Kennedy because her purpose was to smear John Kennedy. She was put in the White House by the Ronald Reagan gang, Frank Sinatra and John Rosselli and Sam Giancana. She was supposed to leave her little satin panties under the pillow so that when Kennedy was dead, they would hope he would be defamed and discredited as a sleazy, oversexed president and not worthy of any tears or thought. Don't read his speeches because there's pants under the pillow. Well, in this case, she's writing a book about a man who's still president of the United States and has videotapes that they said on the news this evening. I got a call just before I came in, and the news said on KGO and ABC that it goes all the way up to the top and all the heads up to the top of the country. So this isn't a dead president. This is a living president who's fighting for his life and his reputation that's been sleazed from the word go. And she thinks she's going to sit and write a book about him. And Betsy, with Mr. Zipkin and Roy Cohn and the gang that they got, and Frank Sinatra and Marvin Davis, she thinks she's safe because Judith Exner and other women did a show and tell book. Well, it's not the same thing. You can write about a congressman, but certain people wanted the congressman out. That's why the books were allowed, so that the differences were pathetic. Now, obviously, the news media and the powers that be thought that there'd be a suicide note. This was a different kind of a death, and the headlines were horrendous, and we have again gone away from no more heart attack. This wasn't an apparent heart attack. It wasn't an apparent suicide. She wasn't dead from cleaning her gun. She didn't die in a car crash. She didn't accidentally medicate by a depression. She didn't go up in a plane crash. I talked last week about Dorothy Hunt. She didn't have 3-week cancer like Ruby or 3-year cancer like Martha Mitchell. She wasn't robbed by somebody who didn't know she was for drugs. They didn't mistake the identity by the police department. She wasn't found in the woods with her pants wrapped around her legs like Kevin Mulcahy. She wasn't hanging from a bridge like Roberta Calvi. She didn't jump out the window like the secretary to Banco Ambrosione. She was missing. She wasn't missing. She didn't seem despondent. She was moving to another place and she was scared. It wasn't a fight of passion. He said, I don't even like her. There's nothing platonic. He said, I did it for poor Alfred Bloomingdale because she took advantage of him and even her own mother. So I had to end their misery. Alfred's been dead a year. So why does he have to kill her now? Alfred can't do anything about that. So how would he know? And she didn't fall drunk and hit her head on the table like William Holden or Charles McCabe in San Francisco. And she didn't drown with her shoes or clothes on like Natalie Wood. They are running out of styles to die. What they did was they simply clubbed her on the head. The headline says, accused killer says Morgan used people. He had to kill her because she used people, or was he serving the White House, which obviously is doing with the stories coming out? Another headline, murdered Vicki Morgan took many secrets to her grave. Hey, young ladies, if they want you for your sex orgies and parties, take note right now. And I don't think that kind of audience is listening, but be careful who you see, because sure, it goes to your grave. That's the point. You do it for their pleasure, and when their pleasure ends or you talk, to the grave you go. Another headline, bizarre motive in mistress death, and that's the one of the Mercy killing. And then the worst I saw today was the Los Angeles Herald. Why Vicki never woke up. Roommate of ex-Bloomingdale mistress admits beating her to death in her sleep. If she woke up, it would really be into the occult or ghost stories. Why she never woke up is he took a baseball bat and smashed her head open. Imagine an obscene headline, why she never woke up, and then she's bludgeoned to death. She couldn't even have a fight. There wasn't even a scratch on this guy because he decided to do it that way. Now, getting back to the point about cover stories and murders and covering them up, whether it's John Belushi or Jack Ruby or Lee Harvey Oswald or other these people, the media, certain people in the media had key stories they were going to drop about Vicki Morgan. And being as there was time running out and the scandals are breaking in Washington, they had to just bang her on the head and forget the cover stories because they couldn't conveniently get her to commit suicide. She was running away from her house. She had an overdose, as I say, on drugs. So in the Los Angeles Herald, they had a smear story, and in other newspapers too, and the stories run, and maybe you've seen them. These are some of the quotations. She was thrice married from a broken home. She had an illegitimate son. She was out of money. She was out of work. She wanted fame. She wasn't a good actress. Fame had to creep through the door by exposing Bloomingdale. She didn't have cash. She had to come down of a standard of living. She dabbed in the occult. She wanted an attorney whose wife knew astrology. She was mysterious. She was a loner. She didn't mingle with others. She went to the Lee Strasberg acting studio and never made anything of herself. She had a brief acting career, a movie that never came out. Now it'll be a multi-million-dollar bestseller. And all of this would apply if she were Lee Harvey Oswald or James Earl Ray or Sirhan or Arthur Bremer, because that's the script. You're a loner, you have no money, you don't like your society. She was asleep in her bed. She was moving the next day. She hadn't popped one single pill. And the Salinas, California paper, a friend called and read me the article there, he poured wine down her and got sure that she was really doused with wine. He said, I get tired of hearing her talking about these things, her complaints. So he gave her lots and lots of wine and then oiled her feet with baby oil. That's a good way to run away, too, in case your skull holds together for 1 minute. He oiled her feet and filled her with wine, and when she was sound asleep, and that was his last night because he was leaving the next day and she was leaving, she's cracked open in the head. The assailant said in all these articles, if you see it, he didn't love her. It was platonic. He wasn't sure where she was moving. As I say, he felt sorry for her mother and Alfred Bloomingdale, and he knew Bloomingdale for 4 years. And goodness knows what he was up to. And he worked at the Robert Morris agency that hired writers and authors, and William Morris agency, and I want to get into that a little bit too. Vicki Morgan was scared. She called a mover, and this is a story from the LA Examiner, July the 8th. She called a company called the Elephant Movers and said she was desperate. The people said she was desperate. Somebody had left her down. She said, I have to get out the next day. She said, this is a quotation, she sounded almost desperate. I quoted a price. She said she didn't care what it cost. That doesn't sound like she's out of money. She didn't care what it cost. I told her the mileage charge. She said it doesn't matter. The tone of her voice was, just do it. I want to get out of here. And the person at the moving agency said people normally ask a lot of questions about mileage and so forth, but she wanted to get out in a hurry any way she could. Not one question of cost, not one question of distance. And then this man who murdered her was on the phone. He grabs the phone. And the woman at the I keep calling it travel agency. She took a trip. That's pathetic. Bad joke. Okay, the moving agency, the people, the elephant movers, they talked to the man who was on the phone and said, where is she moving to, so they'd know how far to move her. And he said, according to the newspaper, I think she was moving to Burbank. That means he had one more night there, and then her Doberman pinscher might bark, and the kid might be home, a 14-year-old kid. He might be even playing baseball with his own bat, instead of it having killed his mother. So the point is that he didn't know where she was going. She was getting out of there, and she was frantic, and he is on the line. So what does she have? Just a few more hours? They're open maybe till 4 or 5 o'clock. She only has to get to sleep, and at 3 in the morning, he goes to the police and did it. So he admitted he wasn't going to have an apartment with her. They were going to have separate apartments, and he thought it was Burbank. So she hadn't told him where she was going to go or what part of the city, and she did have a funeral paid for by somebody, a very fine funeral, and there is money, and she had checks coming in from Fort Lauderdale. She was not destitute. So he has one night to do it, and he can't get her to write a suicide note, I guess, and she can't overdose on these various things, and she's not despondent enough to take her own life. And maybe that last night he just didn't happen to have a gun around. Maybe he thought he had more time and came home, and she's moving and calling the movers. So he only has that amount of time if he's a hired killer to do it, and he's got to do it. And so he oils her and winds her and puts her down. Now, the timing of the situation is interesting. I always like to put things in chronological order. It takes a lot of time, but when I'm through, it's rewarding. A book came out 3 weeks ago called Gambling with History, Reagan's First 2 Years in the White House. Gambling with History. It's like the Seymour Hersh book on Henry Kissinger and the other exposés on the Reagans coming out. It's by Lawrence I. Barrett, B-A-R-R-E-T-T. Reagan's First 2 Years in the White House, Heaven Help Us. It came out June the 8th, and in that book, he picked up a remark that David Stockman said several years ago about how they use the stolen material. Again, it may be like a Watergate, like James McCord. Stockman set the ball rolling with George Will and the far right, and this may be the Reagan Gate. They say that this will prove to Reagan that the liberals, like Mr. Baker or Casey and Allen, are too liberal, and that you need a far right. You can't trust these middle of the grounders. Okay, this book came out with the exposés that would involve various aspects of the Ronald Reagan administration, and in the book, a friend went to the library today to get the book out of the library for me. It doesn't mention Alfred Bloomingdale by name, but it does mention the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board that Alfred Bloomingdale was on, and it does mention Richard Allen as being a consultant to that advisory board. So this book came out just June the 8th, and 3 weeks later, Marvin PANCOAST, in case I haven't spelled it, P-A-N-C-O-A-S-T, he moves in with Vicki Morgan just at the time that this book on the Reagan administration is coming out, 3 weeks before her death. Now, there were charges, as I say, of sex and White House and moles and campaign information that was taken from the Carter people. But the sex videotapes that Mr. PANCOAST offered his lawyer of people high up in the White House, of Mr. Bloomingdale, of a prominent businessman, of one elected person, official not from California, and 3 appointed by Ronald Reagan. The orgies that went on in California were infamous, and I'm sure that when you start getting this man apart, Ronald Reagan, or if you really delved into Richard Nixon with his friends B.B. Rebozo and Mr. Albanap, what went on with that gang, you'd have another view of America. But thank goodness people like Mr. Barrett and Seymour Hersh are doing these books. So the stories of sex and White House mole came out, and at the same time, this past week, there's stories of the pilfered paper that involved Richard Allen, the National Security Advisor, who worked with Mr. Alfred Bloomingdale, and he also worked on the Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board at a time when Bloomingdale, as I said before, was appointed 1 month after he went into a written business partnership with Vicki Morgan. She was much more than just a person who watched Alfie get on the backs of women while he beat them and drooled them, and men also, and had his sex orgy. She was described by her attorney as a person who worked in espionage, and we'll get to the sources of that. Incidentally, the Los Angeles Herald, September 18th, 1982, if you want to look it up, has a story about Vicki Morgan's business. She was a business partner in the Pizza Palace, and Paul Pendergast, Pendergast, the vice president of Brock Hotel Corporation, who owns 80% of that place, said that Vicky owns 10%, along with Bloomingdale and a Mr. McComas, capital MC, capital COMAS, investment company, out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. They're all joint owners of the company, Mr. Pendergast, Mr. Bloomingdale, and Vicky Morgan. Mr. William McComas lives in Fort Lauderdale, and he and his daughter and two men who he refused to identify are the partners in this company. Now, remember when Pete Wilson, our senator from San Diego, was caught on his energy tax matters and had tax shelters in Texas and Gardena, he had unnamed silent partners. And John DeLorean is holding up the settlement of his suit. He's supposed to go to trial. He keeps delaying it because he won't name who puts money into the Panama banks, the Swiss banks, his silent partners, and his moving around of millions of dollars. So Vicky Morgan had an income. She was a partner. She was to be paid, as I said before, $10,000 a month for 2 years, starting March 1982, to get a total of $240,000 from the profits of the Marina Bay offices in Florida, jointly owned with William McComas. And the contract was signed February the 12th, 1982. And in March, Alfie, her co-partner, is on the Foreign Intelligence Board with Richard Allen. So there was a nest through the years with Vicky Morgan, Bernie Cornfeld, Robert Vesco, Richard Allen, William Casey, and the whole gang. Incidentally, Time Magazine, October 14th, 1982, my good friend called me to remind me of the article on King Alfred and Queen Betsy, that he was to be called King Alfred. If she whipped the girls, if they didn't call him king, then they were to be ripped harder. He was King Alfred, and she was good Queen Betsy. I'm sorry, it wasn't just Queen Betsy. It was good Queen Betsy. Now, in September 82, the palimony case was thrown out by Judge Christian Markey in Los Angeles. He as much as said, you're nothing but a common whore. You don't get a share of what you did for 14 years with him, although her attorney said she was a business partner, and they threw out a bulk of the trial. But the point is that there was still more trial to come. She was writing a book. She had a business percentage, and a trial was coming up. So why did he have to wipe her out? Well, the answer is obvious. To silence what he knew, what she knew. PANCOAST had these movies and these tapes and was with her just 3 weeks, supposedly helping her with a particular book. There was a story November 28, 1982, how Nancy Reagan was simply furious at Betsy Bloomingdale because she's so pig-headed that she could have stopped the entire palimony suit if she had paid off Vicky Morgan early, instead of getting into the sex acts and the drooling and the whipping and the men, the women, and the sadomasochism and the Jekyll and Hyde of Alfred Bloomingdale. Now, this is maybe a 15, 20-year-old friendship with Reagan, and all the time he's been married to Nancy, and here's a Jekyll and Hyde on the CIA Foreign Intelligence Board. It gives you some idea of what Richard Allen and William Casey have for us and what goes on in Washington, D.C. Why can't we just get one character without the other? But he's described as this Jekyll and Hyde, and Nancy at the time was simply furious. She and Betsy are very close. Nancy had a birthday party this week, and Betsy was there with Mr. Zipkin, the walker that she passed on to Betsy, their mutual friend. Many of you remember the tape I did. I'll do more on Zipkin later. But Marvin Mitchelson, M-I-T-C-H, Mitch, Olson, E-L-S-O-N, was the attorney for Vicky Morgan when the palimony came on. He's very famous for that, trying to get money for women who've lived with very wealthy men for over 7 or 10 years. And he was called to Washington, D.C. to talk to Morgan Mason. And he was a presidential aide on very important presidential affairs. This is the kind of thing the president has to do. And Mitchelson went to Washington, D.C., you may remember the story, and they were simply furious about what is going on with Vicky Morgan. Well, he couldn't back out on that case, but what he did do was he dropped her 3 weeks after the one case and left the pending case with somebody else. He took orders from the President of the United States. This is like Lyndon Johnson calling in Earl Warren and say, I demand that you have what was known as the Warren Commission investigate the President. And Earl Warren literally cried, and he said, were you in the service? Yes, I'm your commander-in-chief. You do it. He did it. The rest is history. Ronald Reagan demanded that Mitchelson, take care of this matter. So he went off the case, and then the story goes on that Vicki Morgan needed money because her business wasn't going so well until the pizza sold better. So she decided to write a book and work with the William Morris Agency. Now, here's the story of the William Morris Agency, because that brings in the conflict of this particular wipeout of Vicki Morgan. William Morris Agency not only represents actors and actresses, but writers, political writers like Henry Kissinger, Alexander Haig, Jerry Ford, Betty Ford. The Reagans will get a $2 or $3 million book out of the William Morris Agency when they step out of the White House. So to glorify them, to make the agency bring in its big bucks, they have to make their heroes look better than anything in America. So William Morris Agency, she goes with her little story, will you get me a publisher? And who's working at the William Morris Agency for 16 months, but the fellow who's going to split our head open. That's where he worked. So at the William Morris Agency that works for the people, that she has the videotapes on. She's got the goods on the Sinatras and the Bloomingdales and the Haigs and the Kissingers and all the kinky sex from coast to coast. And these people are allegedly she's going to trust to get her book out when they're going to negate all the other grandiose $20 and $30 books they're trying to get out, the coffee table books of American history. So her murderer, not her lover, worked 18 months, one story 16 months, one 18 months for the William Morris Agency. Now that is like Thane Caesar, who worked for Lockheed with the U-2 flights, coming from Lockheed, where they set up the assassination teams with Robert Mayhew and the Howard Hughes Organization and Mo Dalitz and that gang, the espionage inside of Lockheed. They send Thane Caesar to guard Robert Kennedy at the Ambassador Hotel. They can't have a police that night. They have to have a Lockheed espionage spy who shoots him from the back of the head. So in this case, they take a guy from the William Morris Agency. She has this suit pending. He stays away and moves in with her just 3 weeks ago, or in a short time period, not a lover, and described as a former duplicator machine operator. Now, some of the newspaper articles say he was a clerk. Some say he was a duplicator machine operator. All of that is cover story like Watergate. It's like when Lee Harvey Oswald worked at Riley Coffee Company. They said he oiled the coffee cans. He gave him a job on the 6th floor and said, walk down to the 1st floor and here's the oil, grease the machines. They didn't say that Riley Coffee Company was run by Mullen Associates, which was E. Howard Hunt and Douglas Caddy and the entire Watergate team of Mr. Colson and the espionage CIA operation going back to the Bay of Pigs, that his salary comes from Washington to oil the cans. The fact that the guy worked a copying machine has nothing to do with him or about him or how he murdered her or why he murdered her, except that this man wants to be president again, and nobody in Washington, and certainly his appointees, don't want their orgies photographed. And if they destroy the films, which the attorney said he's going to do tonight, there'll be more orgies. The LAPD has orgies coming out of the walls. If you want them to order, they'll be on videotape. Some night, I predict 20 years from now, you'll sit back and watch your politicians with the sex orgies they had. I remember years ago, my grandfather used to talk about television. He said, someday you'll sit home and watch the Metropolitan Opera in your living room. And I remember the first night it was televised, and I sat there crying because my grandfather had this great vision, and he could see these things, and it did happen. Well, soon these will be for sale because you can't make something and keep it private. So someday we're going to show Alfred Bloomingdale and Ronald Reagan and all of them, messed around. And it's on tape, and you can't erase that kind of thing. Anybody who keeps one set is silly. And who's the cameraman? He kept his set in some safe deposit. So Vicki knew she was going to be wiped out. Now, she had a trial coming up. The trial was clear-cut case. He had signed a contract with her 1 month before he was hired by the CIA, so you can't say he's senile. And another interesting story, where did she meet Mr. PANCOAST? You know where she met him? In a mental hospital. They were both in a mental hospital in California. She had no symptoms of depression, but he could be programmed, just like Candy Jones was told to kill herself for the CIA down at Paradise Island. Maybe Vicki didn't cooperate. Maybe it was time to do it, and she didn't do it. The newspaper says she took secrets to her grave. But interestingly enough, PANCOAST was in a mental hospital with Vicki Morgan. That's where he allegedly met her, and then goes to work for William Morris Agency, which is one of the highest agencies in the United States, right out of the funny farm into William Morris Agency. Well, our time is up. We'll have to do part 2 of Vicki Morgan next week because this story is not going to wash away. It is part of Americana, as I said before. In the meantime, this is Mae Brussell on KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, and you take care until next week.
The views expressed by Mae Brussell during World Watchers are those of the commentator and do not reflect the opinions of KAZU, its board of directors, or staff.